Jacob Hawthorne had always been a quiet man, the kind who kept his thoughts hidden behind calm eyes and slow, steady movements. People in the small ranching towns often said he had the patience of a stone and the kindness of someone who had walked through many storms and learned not to let the world turn him bitter. He never started fights, never bragged, and never tried to shine in front of others. He simply did his work, cared for the horses, fixed fences, and moved cattle along the endless desert trails of the Arizona Territory. Most days passed the same way, one long stretch of sand and wind blending into the next. But on one dry afternoon, while guiding a small herd across a lonely stretch of land, something changed. Something felt wrong. It began with a sound he almost ignored, a faint echo carried on the wind, not loud enough to be clear, yet too sharp to be natural. Jacob stopped his horse and listened again. The cattle shifted restlessly, sensing his unease. He narrowed his eyes at the horizon. To the west sat an old abandoned barn, leaning crookedly as if tired of standing. No one had used it in years. It shouldn't have held any life, yet the strange feeling tugged at him, quiet but stubborn. He trusted such instincts. They had saved his life more than once. He tied the cattle to a patch of mesquite brush so they wouldn't wander, and guided his horse toward the barn. As he approached, he moved slowly, scanning the ground for signs. He found footprints, several of them, heavy, careless, belonging to people who weren't trying to hide their presence. That alone made Jacob uneasy. Most travelers in this territory moved quietly, carefully. These tracks suggested the opposite. Men who didn't care who saw them. Jacob left his horse behind and crept closer, keeping low. Through one of the broken wall gaps, he spotted movement. A man sat near a small fire, sharpening a knife. Another leaned against a post, yawning. They weren't lawmen, soldiers, or ranch hands. Their clothes were rough, mismatched, and their expressions carried a certain cruelty he'd seen before, the look of men who took what they wanted and feared nothing. Jacob's attention shifted to the far corner of the barn. At first he thought it was just a pile of blankets or gear. Then the pile moved. His breath caught. It wasn't gear. It was a young woman, an Apache woman tied at the wrists, her posture exhausted, her face pale with fear and fatigue. Even from a distance, Jacob could see she wasn't being treated with kindness. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her shoulders slumped from days of strain. Yet she remained silent, as if conserving the last of her strength. A wave of anger rose inside Jacob. Not wild or loud, but cold and steady like a tightening knot. He had seen people treated unfairly before. He had seen lives ruined by those who thought might was a right. And he had made a promise to himself long ago that he would never again walk away from someone who needed help. But he also knew rushing in would get her and himself hurt. He backed away quietly, hid behind a ridge, and waited. Hours passed. The sun fell lower, turning the desert gold, then orange, then purple. The men eventually grew careless. Most of them settled into sleep, leaving only one awake. Jacob studied their patterns, memorized their movements, and chose the safest moment. When full darkness covered the land, he approached again, barefoot to silence his steps. The barn creaked softly in the night wind, masking the faint noise he made. The last awake man dozed off, his head dropping forward. Jacob slipped inside. The woman noticed him instantly and stiffened with fear. Jacob raised a hand slowly, palm open, showing he meant no harm. He whispered gently that he wanted to help. She looked at him with disbelief at first, unsure if this was another trick. But something in his eyes, something calm and honest, made her hesitate instead of pulling away. He used a small knife to cut the rope around her wrists, careful not to touch her more than necessary. Her skin had marks from the harsh bindings, but she didn't complain. When the ropes finally fell, she tried to stand and almost collapsed. Jacob caught her lightly under the arms, steadying her but not holding her tightly. She was weak, trembling, and he could feel her uncertainty, fear, and a kind of quiet strength beneath it all. They slipped out of the barn together. The sky above glittered with stars, bright against the deep black desert. Jacob guided her toward his horse. She struggled to walk, and he supported her, moving slowly to keep her comfortable. He helped her onto the horse and climbed up behind her, keeping a respectful distance so she wouldn't feel threatened. As soon as they started moving, the woman leaned slightly back. Exhausted beyond her limits, Jacob whispered that she could rest, that he would keep her safe. They rode for miles before stopping. A cold wind swept across the desert, carrying dust and the smell of distant rain. Jacob found a narrow rocky alcove where they could hide from the weather. He made a small fire not too bright and gave the woman water. She drank slowly, each swallow careful. When she finally spoke, her voice was faint, almost broken. She said her name was Nalin, and explained in simple English how she had been taken while searching for her younger cousin. She didn't share every detail, but Jacob could tell she had been treated unfairly and harshly. He listened quietly, his heart tightening with each word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask for more. He simply let her speak until she grew too tired. The storm began shortly after, filling the desert with cold wind and flashes of distant lightning. Inside the alcove, Nalin shivered. Jacob removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders without touching her directly. She looked at him in surprise, studying him as if trying to understand his intentions. Why would a stranger help her? Why risk angering the men who had captured her? Why care at all? Jacob didn't give her a long explanation. He just said quietly, "Because it's the right thing." Nalin stared at the fire, thinking deeply. She had spent her life hearing warnings about outsiders, about how they could not be trusted. Yet here was one, sitting beside her in silence, keeping watch instead of sleeping, choosing to protect her though he owed her nothing. As the night stretched on, Jacob stayed awake, listening for footsteps or distant voices. Once, he heard something far away, maybe a shout carried by the wind. The bandits had surely discovered her escape. They would follow the tracks. Dawn would bring danger. Nalin noticed his alert posture and understood. She whispered that she didn't want him to suffer because of her. But Jacob shook his head. He told her she wasn't a burden. She deserved to go home, to be safe, to live without fear. When morning finally arrived, soft, pale light spread across the sand. Nalin tried to stand again. She still moved with difficulty, but she was stronger than the night before. Jacob helped her onto the horse for another long journey. Neither of them knew exactly what waited ahead, but both understood they couldn't stop. The chase had begun, and danger was close. And yet, somewhere along the endless desert trail, a connection had formed, quiet, fragile, but real. It wasn't romance or drama. It was trust born in the hardest moment of two very different lives crossing at exactly the right time. Jacob didn't know what the future held. Nalin didn't know if she would ever see her family again. But for now, she was not alone. She had someone willing to stand beside her, no matter the cost. And that was enough to keep both of them moving forward into the rising sun. The morning sun rose slowly over the Arizona desert, spreading soft gold across the land. Jacob guided the horse carefully, keeping Nalin steady in front of him. She still felt weak, but she held herself with quiet strength. Every now and then, she looked over her shoulder to make sure he was still there, as if afraid he might disappear and leave her alone again. Jacob noticed, but he pretended not to. He didn't want her to feel embarrassed. He simply kept riding, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. Hours passed in silence except for the soft thud of hooves and the whisper of wind sweeping across the sand. Nalin finally spoke, her voice low and thoughtful. She said she didn't understand why he helped her. Jacob answered with the same calm honesty as the night before. He told her that no one deserved to be treated unfairly, and he wasn't the type of man to turn away when someone needed him. Nalin listened with a thoughtful expression, absorbing his words. The desert stretched far ahead of them, wide and unforgiving. Jacob knew they had to move deeper into Apache land to keep her safe. It was dangerous for him, but he preferred that danger over letting the bandits find them. He didn't want a fight. He didn't want harm to come to anyone. He simply wanted to get Nalin home. As they traveled, Nalin began to share more about her people and the land around them. She explained which plants offered water, which tracks belonged to wild animals, and how to avoid dry ravines that looked safe from a distance but could collapse under weight. Jacob listened with respect, learning from her as she had learned from him the night before. Their cooperation felt natural, like two paths slowly merging. By midday, they reached a stretch of rocky ground where footprints would be harder to follow. Jacob led the horse through narrow passages, occasionally stopping to help Nalin walk when the terrain became too rough. She tried to refuse the help at first, not wanting to appear weak, but Jacob reminded her gently that she didn't have to prove anything. She finally accepted, leaning on him lightly as they moved between the stones. Later, while resting under the shade of a tall boulder, Nalin noticed Jacob's tired eyes. He had barely slept all night. She insisted he take a short rest, while she kept watch. Jacob hesitated but agreed when she insisted firmly. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and within moments drifted into a light sleep. Nalin sat nearby, holding his small knife for protection, scanning the desert with the same sharp watchfulness her people were known for. It was the first time she had ever protected someone outside her tribe, and the responsibility felt strangely important. After an hour, Jacob woke and thanked her. They continued onward, and little by little, the land around them changed. There were more signs of life, tracks of deer, small streams hidden between rocks, and scattered patches of green brush. Jacob knew they were entering territory watched closely by Apache scouts. He grew more cautious, raising his hands whenever they reached open spaces, just in case hidden eyes were studying him. Nalin noticed the change and assured him that her people did not harm those who came with peaceful intentions. Jacob nodded, though he remained careful. He understood well that misunderstandings were deadly on both sides, and he wanted to avoid any chance of conflict. The afternoon passed quietly until Nalin suddenly stopped and raised her hand. Jacob froze. Her posture changed instantly, alert, almost relieved. She whispered that they were close to one of the lookout points used by her tribe. She motioned for Jacob to stay behind her as a sign of peace. Not long after, a faint rustle echoed from the cliffs above. Jacob felt a pressure in the air, a sense of being watched. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he stepped back, lowered his head, and waited. Within seconds, 5 Apache warriors appeared from behind the rocks, silent and swift. Their presence was strong, but their expressions changed the moment they saw Nalin. One of them rushed forward, her brother, recognizable by the way Nalin called his name. He grabbed her shoulders, eyes filled with shock and relief. Speaking quickly in their language, Nalin answered with tears in her eyes, her voice trembling from the emotion she had held in for days. Jacob stood still, letting them reunite. He felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred, but he didn't move until Nalin's brother finally turned to him. The warrior studied Jacob carefully. There was caution in his eyes, but also curiosity. Nalin spoke on Jacob's behalf, explaining everything that happened, how he had found her, helped her escape, kept her safe, and refused to abandon her even when it placed him in danger. Her brother listened intently, his expression softening. The warriors lowered their weapons and nodded as a sign of acceptance. One of them quietly invited Jacob to follow them. Jacob looked at Nalin for reassurance, and she nodded with a small smile. He walked behind them, respectful and humble, as they guided him into a valley hidden between 2 large cliffs. Inside, more members of Nalin's tribe gathered. Her mother ran forward and embraced her daughter tightly. Her father, a strong but gentle man, offered Jacob a solemn nod of respect. They didn't speak English, but Jacob could read the gratitude in their expressions. Nalin was taken to a warm shelter to rest. Meanwhile, Jacob was invited to sit by a fire. Food and water were offered, simple but meaningful. In Apache culture, sharing food with a stranger who comes in peace is a deep gesture of trust. Jacob accepted quietly, touched by the warmth of their welcome. Over the next 2 days, Nalin recovered her strength. She smiled more, laughed softly with her family, and her eyes regained the spark they had lost. Yet she often glanced toward the place where Jacob sat, as if making sure he was still there. Jacob stayed mostly silent, not wanting to interfere, but he felt a strange comfort in seeing her safe and surrounded by love. When he finally prepared to leave, Nalin approached him. She thanked him, her voice steady but emotional. She said his kindness had changed something inside her. She admitted she once believed outsiders never cared about her people, but Jacob's actions had shown her that goodness existed in unexpected places. Jacob removed his hat and nodded, not trusting himself to say much. He simply told her he was glad she was home and safe, and that he would remember her courage for the rest of his life. Nalin stepped closer and placed her hand over her heart, a gesture of deep respect in her culture. Jacob understood the meaning even without words. It was not a promise or a farewell filled with dramatic emotion. It was a quiet acknowledgement that their paths had crossed for a reason, leaving a mark neither would forget. Jacob mounted his horse. Nalin's family stood behind her as she watched him ride away, the desert wind lifting her dark hair. Jacob glanced back once, seeing her silhouette against the rising sun. For a moment, everything felt still, peaceful. Then he turned forward again, riding into the open land. Nalin returned to her family's camp, her spirit stronger than before, carrying with her the memory of a stranger who showed her that compassion could cross any border. Jacob returned to his life on the ranch trails, knowing he had done the right thing, even if no one else would ever hear the full story. But both carried the same truth inside them. A single act of courage and kindness could change two lives, even if only for a brief moment in the vastness of the world.